Mary, are you there? Can you hear us? Can she see?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, I had my mic on mute.
Well, let's. Well, I don't know. Maybe us. Yeah, that'd be great. So, yeah, that'd be great. So Mary, we're just gonna. I don't know where to look. I'm looking at you at the screen. We're gonna just go through this list, and whoever wants to answer will. So you'll have to jump in.
I can't hear you.
She's like, we have
to. How are your cats? Specify that maybe Mary. Where are you, Mary? Where are you?
I don't have like a 10-foot face, do I?
Yeah. 12 actually. And we can now figure that out.
Exactly. It's like a strange mirror.
Yeah. Where are you?
I'm in Mozambique.
I can't believe it's been this long. Well, this is a great idea.
So you are the, what's your actual title?
I am the operations manager, the social behavioral educational. Yeah, I haven't taught in a little while. No, that's quite as truthful as it used to be.
Grace is. So what did, so I looked on the website. What did you do to, who did you put out to become the associate
one of
chair?
three associate chiefs.
Yeah, one. And you're the Mellon Professor of Modern Dance? Yeah.
That's cool. You're very good.
Practice.
Just letting you wear my
Yeah. I always wear a tie. And they're going, for sure nobody will wear a tie.
I never do, but I figured I dress up because I knew you would.
See what happens.
In our division, the hematologist, this is the uniform, is the sleeve with the sweat vest.
Yeah. The hematologist and the oncologist?
No, just the hematologist.
Just the hematologist.
Is there any reason?
No, whatsoever. Other than it's kind of chilly.
Exactly.
Check, test. 1, 2, test.
And the oncologist actually wear boxer shorts with cartoon characters?
On their heads. Who knew? It's just a thing.
It's all right.
I know. You see that everywhere now. They were doing it before it was cool. Exposing themselves on the TV, that kind of thing.
I tell ya. It's quite hilarious. When it started to escalate, you could see everybody taking their phones out and like texting people and quite hilarious.
You know, I knew that I didn't miss public transportation, but now I have another reminder. And on the green line, what line was it?
The red line.
Oh, the red line.
It was, at the Harvard Square. So.
Oh, okay. Oh, Harvard. Well,
Harvard
actually,
Central, that's a great one.
a little unusual. A little unusual between those stops.
I got a text from my mother being like, "What a day," or something like that. I'm like, "Are you talking about Matt Lauer?" He's like, "No." It's like I was talking about your tea, right? And I was like, "Oh,
So I always knew there was something funny about him. So like 10, 12 years ago, Sue Roberts was supposed to appear on Today Show, and as Sue is wont to do, if she thinks everything is a good idea, then back right. So I was sent in her stead. Really? Yeah. So I, it was great for my mother. And I was really looking forward to be interviewed by Katie Couric, I got Matt Lauer, and he wouldn't take his
good story."
Yeah, well, the places I've gone or things I've seen because of Sue doing it. I got because I went to Australia for 4 days, which is all I could fit in because she backed out of the speaking engagement. I went to a meeting in Denmark. Yeah, and that was cool. Northern Denmark, and the highlight was it was a largely European crowd, and the highlight was
To talk? You want me to talk?
got on their chairs.
Let's install a bigger microphone for you.
In the great room.
The thing Sue is.
I don't do that stuff anymore.
So this is, oh no, this is its strategy.
No, it's right back with it. You ever feel that
It really does. Because since she's another big we're going to have a problem for Australia. He's in the home, and I just got off the Skype call. So we could have had it.
Well,
I said to him I was so disappointed to not get to see him.
so is that? Well, do they fix it?
I fixed it.
Oh, you did.
I walked over there.
So we're gonna go until somewhere between 1 and 1:15. We have steam and there are questions. So Robin will start in a minute.
Erica, he just secured another for an extension of the aftertax now, which is
Are we
going
ready?
to
Okay.
add not just more blood work, but urine.
Ladies and gentlemen, shall we take your picture?
Ladies should be removed, yeah?
Yeah.
Robin sent me all the answers, by the way.
He sent the answer. Well, so you can actually, he'll be in the background. You're going to be lip syncing.
I'm just gonna grab my coffee.
Who's going to be the problem maker?
Oh, I don't know.
Shall we just introduce ourselves, or do you want to? Right. Shall we start? Welcome. Let's go ahead and get started. So today we will be discussing everything you've always wanted to know about the risks of human research, but were afraid to ask. I guess there aren't many people who are getting that reference. Anyway, yeah. So this is meant to be an interactive session. So if you have questions, please just raise your hand, and we're happy to try to address your questions. Let me just introduce our panel. First, we have Laura Sloboda, who is the operations manager of the Tufts Social and Behavioral IRB, right? And also, we can welcome Laura to Boston. Her office just moved to the Boston campus from Medford to make it, and specifically to make it easier for the Friedman School to interact.
100%.
Yeah. Next, we have Andreas Klein, who is the chair of the Boston Health Science IRB and the associate chief of the Division of Hematology Oncology at Tufts Medical Center. And we have Patrick Webb, a professor at the school who needs no introduction. And lastly, above us, from Mozambique, we have, you haven't defended your thesis yet, correct? So we can't call you Dr. Mary Fitzpatrick.
No, next week.
No, she's PhD to be, right? And so Mary will chime in to talk to us about some of her international experiences as well as perspective as a doctoral student. So we're just going to start. And the first question I'd like the panel to address is really to set the groundwork for our discussion. So I'd just like to ask, what is research? You know, technically, what is research and what is human research?
Technically,
Technically, yes.
according to 45 CFR.
That one, yes.
46101.
That one, yes.
Yeah, so a systematic investigation designed to develop generalizable knowledge
Right.
is the shorthand version.
Exactly. So not that there aren't other types of research, but technically speaking, a systematic investigation designed to generate generalizable knowledge. Right? And what about human research? Does all research involving human beings get classified as, quote, human research?
I can take that one. So a human then is defined, or human research with humans is defined as interactions or interventions. I can actually get closer too if that's helpful. But any interaction or intervention with an individual where you're collecting information or you're obtaining identifiable private information. So you don't need to actually interact with an individual in order to obtain that information. So that's looking at sort of information that's collected or looked at in a secondary analysis like a chart review or reanalysis of data collected previously by other researchers.
So it's possible to actually conduct research and generate data from humans, but have it not be human research. Is that correct? If it's de-identified and right. So it's
So it's data that you would obtain through either interaction or through an identified record.
Mm-hmm. Right. Good. Okay. So that's research. Many of you have conducted human research. Many of you, I think, aspire to it, which is great. So let's talk about the nature of the risks of nutrition research, nutrition and food research. Obviously, some of the risks may involve bodily harm. I can give you an example of bodily harm that might be incurred through some of our studies. In a number of our studies, we are changing diets or we are providing nutrients or other, in some cases, drugs, and we want to know what the effects are on the body. Some of the outcomes can come from blood, but sometimes we want tissue. And so we sometimes will do muscle or subcutaneous fat biopsies. Okay? So those are not, in the medical world, not very invasive procedures. But if you were someone who was a healthy subject, would you want someone like me sticking a needle into your thigh or your abdomen that was a little bit wider than this pen, right? So that's an example of how we can do bodily harm. So, it's sort of basically like liposuction or another kind of biopsy. The risks of those are pretty low. The risks of lasting nerve damage doing a thigh biopsy is about 1 in 10,000. You may get numbness. So the question is, how do we figure out if that's worth it? How does an IRB figure out if it's allowable to do, to let us do that kind of research? So that's one kind of harm. What about other kinds of harm? There's loss of your anonymity. Generally, when you do a research study, we say that we are protecting your identity, but every once in a while, that may actually be violated, not deliberately. And what if there's something about you as a research subject that you don't want disseminated, such as you have a history of substance abuse, or you have HIV, or something like that. So that's another kind of risk. Also, there may be economic risk to you by participating in a study. So so these are different types of risk. So do you know, our panel, Mary, do you have, other risks that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, actually, in some communities, just participating can create suspicion. Especially if you're, say, in a community and there's tension, there could be suspicion just by participating. That could cause risk. That's one potential.
Would that lead to social isolation? Potentially?
A bit. Say if you're in a conflict area and there's a lot of suspicion about supporting one side or another, if they're not sure of who the investigative team is, what your purpose is, or they're suspicious of that suspicion can transfer to the subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great, thanks. Patrick?
Well, yeah, there are so many, and obviously that's what IRBs have to consider. In that kind of context, I know B and others in Ethiopia and looking at food by prescription programs in HIV programming, where food is part of the package with ARTs. Have to think very carefully about how you get food packages to people so that they're not identified by others as having HIV. Having HIV positive, and that's not straightforward. Harms I've seen, usually unintended. If you're doing urine lactose mannitol ratio, collecting urine samples of young kids over a period of 12 hours, let's say. Sometimes having to chase the child across a compound to make sure they don't pee in the corner and you missed it. I've actually seen kids running away from the researcher and falling over the fence and breaking their arm. And that's bodily harm, right? I mean, come back, come here. Chasing, the chickens were all scattering at the same time. There's psychological, obviously. One of the first pieces of research I did in Ethiopia was just at the tail end of the big famine in the 1980s, and I'm coming at this from a social science perspective and working for a Washington-based think tank. No one suggested that I needed to have IRB approval to go and talk to survivors of famine who, by definition, were traumatized by the events and could have been further harmed through the kinds of questions. But back then, in the 80s, on the social sciences, that was not even on our radar. So we have to think not just the physical, but clearly the psychological.
Right. And I think one of the challenges is that the physical is often easy to define. We understand what a punch biopsy looks like, and it's not always easy to define, but that tends to be what we think of more when we think about risk and research. And so the psychological or the economic are often harder to really get those nuances. And so we, as from an IRB perspective, will often rely on sort of the experience of the researchers to really kind of understand what those risks might be when we do those risk benefit analyses, because it is often times harder to figure out what the psychological risk or an economic risk with research might be.
Absolutely, yeah. Those are some of the hidden risks involved. As long as we're talking about types of risk, what are some of the risks that investigators might encounter? Actually, it reminds me of a story that Mary had told us about when she was collecting data for her thesis, and I can't remember if it was, were you in Mozambique or somewhere else, and it was after the rainy season, and either your Jeep was engulfed in a pothole larger than the Jeep, or you, yeah, that was it, right?
Pretty nearly, yeah.
Yeah, so there's obviously those kind of issues, but there are potential issues related to research, especially if you are investigating the effects of an intervention on a communicable disease such as HIV, viral hepatitis, tuberculosis, and I have a colleague who was conducting research on the role of vitamin D on antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis in Eastern Europe. And you're really relying on the people at that site where these patients were hospitalized to help protect you, because this is resistant TB. There is no treatment. So those are some risks that investigators may encounter. Other risks that investigators encounter?
Well, I'll throw in, maybe it's the hardest one for an IRB to predict, is perceived harm among the community or the individuals with whom you're working. Many people working internationally have come across the examples of it only takes one child to get sick or one person to die in the context of a study for the study to be blamed and for things to get very rapidly out of hand. And it could be it's simply, recumbent length, the length board measuring a child, and the next day that child died, and of course it's because it looked like a coffin, and therefore no other child shows up to be measured ever again, right? Or it could be the shape, and these are actual examples, the shape of a pill a supplement that was being used as a multivitamin trial, but the shape was eye-shaped, essentially, ovoid, whatever. And one child got very sick and had desperate diarrhea, and it was immediately thought, oh, well, that's because it's the evil eye, and those people are distributing the evil eye to all our children and going to kill them all, right? So those are not necessarily, they're not predictable usually.
They're not, right.
But the risk can become very physical if the community really gets agitated.
Okay. So,
Yeah,
go ahead.
So I'd sort of be interested to hear from the panel and others too. This is something that we struggle with a bit in the IRB. So the IRB is concerned, it gets its authority through the National Research Act of 1972, which grew out of primarily driven by the experience of the Tuskegee syphilis study. That was the thing that really brought it to the fore, and Senator Ted Kennedy really brought that forward, and so it's in 72, 74, and they authorized then the executive branch to come up with a set of rules. And so when we talk about 45 CFR 46, it's not facetious, but that's really a set of rules laid out by Congress that determines what the responsibilities of the IRB are. And because the federal government cannot oversee, it can regulate interstate commerce and national defense and nothing, right, not beyond that. It can't really impose this on anybody. But what they do control is the funding through NIH. And so any study that's funded through HHS, through Health and Human Services, then the funding is tied to following the rules according to the federal regulation. But the federal regulations were really designed specifically to protect research subjects, not researchers. So we do get reports, we've had of exactly what you've described, researchers, Tufts researchers working in very rural communities, where some bad outcome happens to one child or to one member of the community, and the community turns around and blames the researcher, and very quickly they're under pressure. They have to leave right away. There's actually physical threats of violence. And on one hand, we're concerned about that, and we're concerned about Tufts personnel or Tufts, people working for Tufts putting themselves in that position, but it's really not the role of the IRB. In one sense, and
it's the role of the schools that sponsor the students who are and staff who are involved in research.
And in fact, when an IRB, in my experience, when we have asked researchers to reflect on the personal risk associated, we get a lot of pushback for overreach, and we don't. So we're in a bind in some cases to say, this is how we perceive the possible risk to the researcher, but that's not our position or our authority. Mm-hmm. And I do think that gives us a chance that we hope to have the backing of the university in those situations to say this might, we're still part of a university. We still have to, as flag bearers of the university, have to help shape, how researchers act in the community, but there's only a degree so much that we can. And so we do, you know, there are offices within the university that can help IRBs with that. We have and if you don't already know this, this is a great office that oversees international travel for all students. You're supposed to, when you travel, log in and say where you're going, and they will approve that travel. And so if there is a real risk, that is.
Yeah, so Mary, tell us. Yeah,
Free travel after
yes,
that, right?
So, by the way, you will not be granted your degree if you didn't follow the regulations.
Not tied.
But so, did you, Mary? Were you aware of registering for international travel with the university? Because it was actually enacted and made a requirement during your tenure as a doctoral student. But did you feel protected in any way by either the institution or the investigators with whom you worked? And if so, well, how? And if not, what would you like to have done for you?
My own thesis research, the protection went to another organization. I was hosted by another organization, so it went to that. When I do research in, say, Darfur, again, the host organization has some responsibility, and the school has some responsibility. And Helen and I, the PI, will discuss what are the risks. But there's sometimes you just have to really understand that you are responsible for the risks you take and understanding what those are to a large extent.
So
some of that, you know, you don't want to just throw somebody out in the middle of a student in the middle of something that they've not experienced before. So there's a certain amount of responsibility of the school, I think, to say, okay, is this person aware and capable of assessing what the risks are.
I think, Mary, you made an important point too, though, that you said that you talk about this with Helen, right? And that's, you know, that communication between researchers and faculty advisors and other advisors, whether or not, you know, even for faculty, the advisors that they might have in their work, I think is really important to understand what those risks might be.
Right. Well, it's easier to understand how we protect students or staff who are conducting biologic type research because they are subject to regulations that mandate laboratory safety training or training in dealing with blood and body fluids. So that's more straightforward, but I don't think there is any training or course in adopting common sense when you're in Darfur. And you know, I've heard stories from both Patrick and people like Dan Maxwell about being in environments where bullets are flying. And I guess it has always made me think, you know, do we have a responsibility of keeping, you know, individuals out of those environments? Investigators, I guess, are capable of making those decisions for themselves, but I don't know if we should be sufficiently protective of students. Does any student have an opinion about that?
I was going to call out Ilana at the back there.
Ilana, what do you think?
Because one of the hardest decisions I've ever had, I don't know, but B and I shared this decision, was in the context of an armed coup where Ilana was working. And a really, really tough call to make in terms of at what point do you order that person to leave, especially if they don't want to leave, especially if they're so vested in the community. I'm not saying that to you, but we've had that in Sierra Leone and elsewhere. If they don't want to leave, what do you do, right? But Ilana, what would you say?
Yeah, I think that it's hard when you have if the people aren't there seeing what's actually happening on the ground. You know, in that situation that Patrick is talking about, I was in Burkina. There was a coup d'état, and I felt like it was at that point fine to stay, and I should stay, and it would send the wrong message if I left. And But if the airport, and my thought was by the time the airport is open, it will be safe again anyway. But, it's hard to it's hard for someone who's not there in that situation to make that decision. And as the person who was in the situation, I felt safe where I was, doing what I was doing, being careful, but making sure that, I also want to look out for myself, and I felt like I should have a lot of say in that decision in terms of what is actually happening on the ground. And because it's hard to know from the news media and from even the U.S. embassy, there were some confusing reports coming out of it. So I guess that the person who is in the actual situation should use their best judgment and not put, I would never put the research above my personal opinion.
Yeah, good. I think that's the
Good
right answer.
Right answer.
So let's go back to talk about research subjects. Right? So when a proposal for human research is submitted, and either that research proposal will have been funded by a federal agency, and then there are clearly some stipulations that apply. But generally, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the IRB tends to treat all protocols conservatively, such that something by a foundation, funded by a foundation, won't be allowed to have more risks or a different risk-benefit ratio than something funded by NIH or NSF or USDA, for that matter. So once a protocol has been proposed, the next stop is one of the IRBs. And perhaps since we have the leaders of both IRBs here, you can once and for all explain to which IRB research from this school should be submitted. All right, so we'll
have a flow chart online.
Okay. All right, it's online.
No, I'm kidding.
So,
I'm happy to talk about
yeah.
it.
Right. But what happens when a proposal goes to the IRB? What's the process by which the risk and potential benefit is weighed? And what are the considerations when dealing with review, especially vis-a-vis risk?
I can start.
Sure, go ahead.
So when we, in the social behavioral office, and in my office, we do have a lot of studies that we determine have risk associated with them, especially in the psychological or economic or social standing type categories. I have to say, first off, that a lot of the research that we see, even if there is some risk associated, we oftentimes still determine it to be minimal risk research.
What's minimal risk?
And minimal risk is poorly defined as essentially the risk that you would experience in everyday life. So there might be times where we are asking people to reflect on their history in, let's say a domestic violence situation where there might be some psychological risk associated with the questions that you're asking them, but this is their history. This is their story and their life, and there actually might be some benefit in being able to have that agency of sharing that information. So as a precursor to this question, we in my office, and thinking about the flow chart of what we review, the social, behavioral, and educational research, we don't get a lot of high-risk research. But for every study, regardless of whether or not we're going to determine that it's minimal risk or that it's greater than minimal risk, we look at the benefits and the risk that are explained by the research team. We think about them in terms of what our experience is as reviewers. And then from an office standpoint, we really rely on the expertise of our IRB panel, our committee members, to help us look at that risk-benefit analysis. If it's determined minimal risk, then we move on to the other issues that come up in the review. But looking at that risk, once we determine, the very, very first thing is it research with human subjects? Once we determine that, we look at the risk, and that helps us triage how we're going to do the review in office and what type of research it gets categorized as.
Yeah, so I would reiterate that. And For the Tufts Health Sciences IRB, it's similar. We work very closely together, although we don't share the same office space yet.
We're in the same city now.
We're on the same street. But what we do is we follow a process where first we look at the research and sort of follow a decision tree. Is this research? Things like quality assurance projects where you're seeing whether you are enough. People are asking about blood pressure management in the General Medical Association, in the clinic. Are people doing, sort of following the rules, the recommended treatment algorithms, things like that, that are really just intended to improve the care of patients here at this institution? That's not going to be research. You're not developing generalizable knowledge. You're just evaluating the process here under this roof. So we're sort of making that decision. So if it's is it research? Is it involve human subjects? So does it involve identifiable, interacting with individuals or using their identified medical record to obtain research? And so if it's not, then that's not going to, we would consider that not human subjects research. We oversee human subjects research, so that becomes out of our purview, and that's a determination that there's no IRB review that's required for that. The next level then is the Congress set out that, again, in the regulations, there's a group of procedures or research that's so innocuous that you don't really need an IRB to overlook that. So things like that that would fall into that category are research regarding educational interventions, research regarding surveys, as long as you're not asking really probing or deep questions, or you're not collecting identifiers that you might associate with something bad. So, how much do you drink? And then you're writing that down on your, on a name, on a survey with somebody's name. That's potentially damaging to somebody if it gets out. Taste testing, things like that are all in that exempt category. And then if it's not exempt, then then it needs IRB review. And when it needs IRB review, it needs consent as part of that. And our next level of triage is to say, are the procedures that are involved in the research, there's a group of them which are pretty well understood to be low risk. Things like routine blood drawing and taking somebody's blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff. Imaging with non-ionizing radiation, so ultrasounds or MRI, and looking at people's medical records and looking at their tissue and things like that. These are all things that are relatively low risk. They fit into this not greater than minimal risk category, so that things that qualify for that can actually receive what we call an expedited review. When I first submitted my first application to the IRB, I said, please expedite this. That's great, that's the term. No, so expedited means it fits a very specific category of research that we are allowed to expedite. And so we have a subgroup of the IRB, that's the chair and the vice chairs, who review that research. And we can turn that, it is expedited review. We can turn that around in a very short period of time because we don't have to put it on an IRB agenda. We don't have to wait for the next meeting, et cetera. And so things that don't fit that expedited category, then they go on to the full board for full board review. And at sort of each step in this, the way this is sort of designed, the Congress, the regulations sort of do follow a risk stratification. Things that aren't research are really very low risk. Things that are exempt are not entirely without any risk, but they're really, really low risk, and we figure you don't need the IRB review. Things that can be expedited are not greater than minimal risk, so as Laura said, it's not greater than what you would encounter in everyday life or physical examination. And so it sort of already automatically follows that level of risk, and when the things that go to the full board are those that are considered to have greater than minimal risk, and those are ones then that are vetted by a group of our peers, both community members, lay community members who have no affiliation with the institution or with science at all. So we have on our board some lawyers, we have a retired nurse, we have some clergy that are engaged with us that all sort of represent of the community experience and the community perspective, as well as physicians, as well as scientists. representing sort of the spectrum of our research community. And the full board then considers together how to balance the perceived risk against potential for benefit.
So if you're balancing the risk and the benefit, does that mean that, for example, that a study conducted in perfectly healthy individuals should be associated, with low risk because you can't improve their health? Maybe you can prevent something in the future, but that doing something very invasive to those people might have an unacceptable ratio, whereas in a population of people with refractory cancer of some sort, you would be more liberal in the risks that were approvable because they have a serious or fatal disease.
I think there are sort of different ways to parse that and to consider that. So I think just because something involves some risk doesn't necessarily exclude somebody, a reasonable person, from saying, I'm still interested in participating in that study. So the muscle biopsy, it can't be pleasant.
Well, when I do it, sometimes it is.
Okay. But that could get infected.
Yeah, of course.
So some things can happen. But you're right. In that situation, there's no benefit at all to the research subject. So it's really altruism is what would drive them to do that. Some people have that streak in them, and for the benefit of science, they'd be willing to participate in some of these things. And some of the things that you do ask them to do are not necessarily risky, but they are certainly arduous. A lot of the exercise testing and walking around the park and all of those.
Or keeping track of diet records continuously for months at a time.
These are all. There's some. There is downside to that. That's not a risk of physical harm. And at the same time, patients with metastatic cancer, yes, are they're at a high risk from their underlying medical condition, but that doesn't mean that they simply because their cancer is bad that they should necessarily that something else isn't still an unacceptable risk. This goes back to research that was done in the 1950s and 60s, and with you may have read the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, who's the source patient for the HeLa cell line, and it was being evaluated, if you will, as a way of detecting cancer, because you could take those cells, the HeLa cells from culture, and inject them into the skin of people. And if they had bad cancer and had a poor immune system, the cancer cells would grow. And just because you had cancer or you were otherwise sick, they were cancer patients who were being injected with these cells just to see what would happen. And those are sort of that we can see that now in the light of day that these are really unacceptable things. So even though the risk of dying of cancer is very high, it doesn't necessarily justify some risks that otherwise carry no benefit or that aren't sort of oriented towards their own treatment.
Can I just ask a question, actually? So risk has a clear science basis here. You described it very carefully. But what about cultural differences, or particularly international differences in particularly relative risk? Right? And are there ever cases where something has been approved by an IRB in a low-income country elsewhere, but you then have doubts? For them, it was the relative risk was fine because their concerns, their immediate risks are different from those here. But for the IRB here, it raised doubts.
So I think that brings up a number of points, and in terms of both how we handle international research and the oversight of international research, and sometimes our reliance on international reviews of research, it also really highlights again the cultural context of the location in which the research is taking place. So we certainly, at least in our office, we certainly strive as best we can to understand the context in which the research is taking place, but our experience or our expertise on the committee only knows so much, right? There's only so many locations in which we conduct research or in which our reviewers have experience conducting research to really get in and really understand what those cultural
the importance of the culture is for the risk, that relative risk. And so in those situations when we don't have that experience or we just don't have the answer, we might rely on an expert content reviewer, somebody to come in and like a one-off sort of situation to say, you know, what the risk might be. I'll give you actually an example. I have a friend who worked for the UNCR for a while, and so she has done content reviews for us when people are going to refugee camps to conduct research to say, you know, these questions, do you carry a backpack home of children? Do you carry a backpack? You know, that might not mean anything to us, but that might mean that that person is then, you know, targeted for somebody that has more valuables than other people within the refugee camp, which might actually, you know, have risk associated with it. So we might rely on expert content reviewers to help us understand what the cultural context is there. So we do certainly try our best to understand what that relative risk is, because it's so certainly important. And there are questions here in the United States that are stigmatized, questions, you know, about like just disease status that are stigmatized here that might not be in another country. So we might be putting more risk associated or thinking that there's more risk with questions that might not actually carry as much risk within that country. And so again, you know, we do rely on the committee. We like to talk to the researchers to get an understanding of what that relative risk might be, and then the committee are our content reviewers as well.
In general, for international research conducted by U.S. universities that are funded through HHS, so is that you're following both the U.S. rules, you have to satisfy all of the U.S. regulations, plus the regulations in the local community. And that can be difficult to figure out. There's a website under HHS which has a listing by country of what the regulatory framework is, what the IRB is, who you can contact. But we have countries that we work with regularly, even for example, Haiti, where there is no national research infrastructure. So there are no local IRBs. So who makes decisions, you know, in those contexts? And we have to work with both the investigator to help us identify who's in a position to judge the research and to judge it particularly from the context of respecting the local context of the local population, and we want to ensure that our researchers are following the letter of the local law in terms of obtaining local IRB approval where there is a local IRB to rely upon.
And an extra wrinkle to that is that a lot of countries that currently have ethics review are built around biomedical or drug and device studies. Exactly. And so having the social behavioral review is oftentimes, I cannot tell you the number of researchers that have gone and said, or for instance, like I was in Nepal and they said, if you want a review, you have to add in a health question to this survey. Right. Exactly. So, okay, well, so, you know, the system might not be in place yet for survey research or for interview type research. And so, you know. But those international reviews, when they exist, you know, they're very important for us to help us really understand, you know, what we think might be acceptable might not be, and those are very important.
Yeah. So a few moments ago, Andreas mentioned the word consent. So maybe you could talk briefly, what is consent, and what are the suppositions? You know, what do we assume when we obtain consent, and how do we actually know it's working?
Oh boy. So thanks for ending that with the unanswerable question. I don't know. So I think at the conclusion of the Second World War, the trials were held in Nuremberg, and the first of those trials was the doctor trial, which prosecuted in individuals who were engaged in research involving human subjects in the concentration camps, particularly in Poland, particularly against Jews and particularly I think also Polish and Soviet soldiers, captured soldiers, and really horrific stuff that we've all sort of heard about. But in order to be able to prosecute, they needed sort of a basis upon which to prosecute. They needed a framework to say these are what we consider to be the ethical standard for the conduct of research, and these were sort of self-evident, and you violated these, and therefore you were guilty of war crimes. And so that came to be known as the Nuremberg Code. And there are 10. There were originally 15 tenets in that, but there are 10. And the first one is that the informed consent of the research subject is paramount. And it's incumbent on all of us to ensure that that happens. Everybody who's engaged in the research enterprise shares responsibility for ensuring that that's the case. So informed research would be, informed consent then is that the potential research subject has really been told all of the important things or the relevant things that would inform their decision making, so that they have all the information in front of them and can weigh the risks and benefits for themselves and come to a decision on their own independently whether or not they want to participate in the research. As far as determining whether or not it's effective, this is much harder to determine, I think, and we sort of functionally think about whether the research subject the potential subject can repeat back to you an explanation of the study. Do they have enough of an understanding that they can relate that back to you, what they understood, and is that a reasonable description of the research that's involved? But I think this is something that has not been very systematically evaluated, and I think we don't really understand what effective research, effective consent is. And there's a lot of controversy around how we would obtain consent, and consent is that discussion that happens and that decision by the individual to participate in the research. We have this other thing called a consent form, which is a documentation that consent occurred. It's not the consent. It's simply a means of documenting the information that was translated. So it's not sufficient to obtain consent by giving somebody the consent form and say, here, see what you think. Right? Consent is a conversation around that. And consent is not a moment in time. Consent is continuous. A research subject has the opportunity to withdraw at any time from the research for any reason whatsoever. And so it's incumbent upon us as researchers not just to ensure that they consented the first time when they started out on the study, but at every point in the study that they're still continuing to participate in the research under their own voluntary consent.
Well, yeah, one of the largest challenges I seem to be facing a lot more these days is not getting effective informed consent from illiterate smallholder farmers, let's say. I mean, that tends to be challenging but feasible. It's actually getting in consent in some form or another from, let's say, a very senior policymaker or a senior government official, right, who totally gets the nature of the research and what they're agreeing to, but flatly refuses to even verbally say, I consent, because they do not want to be on the record in any form. They will not sign a document, they will not put anything, they will not say it. They'll say, oh, I'll talk to you, I'll answer all your questions, but I am not going to say I consent. And this is a real challenge, and it's reputational risk, that they perceive reputational risk if anyone else found out that they gave these answers. And that leaves people like me and others in a quandary in terms of should we even continue, because they actually want to talk, they want to talk, but we can't use it, essentially. We can't use that information.
Can I introduce you to 45 CFR 46.117? Again, consent is two parts. So one is the consent conversation and the agreement to, and then there's the documentation. And there are mechanisms under the regulations that would allow you to not have to document the consent. So we can talk.
Yeah. but it's true, and oftentimes, again, with the international research, it's not appropriate to seek actual documentation, right? So we often will allow researchers to waive the documentation of consent for cultural purposes, and that's it's a non-arduous process to request that of the IRB. And also, you know, again, because this is a process and because the important aspect of it is to get that information across, something that we like to do is work with researchers to understand what is the best way to get it across. Is it a piece of paper? We've actually never done this. I can't wait for the day that we do, but there's a movement towards putting, especially with illiterate populations, putting the consent in pictures, so that it's more almost like a picture book of what the research is actually going to look like. You know, somebody might not know what I actually, I'm sorry for the doctors in this room. Somebody might not, if I use the wrong gauge size, somebody might not know what like a 1 millimeter syringe is, but they might understand it if you put that in a picture. So I think, you know, there's this real movement toward or video consent or toward providing the information in a way that's palatable, usable, and understandable. So
Yeah, well, some have actually offered a handshake, because I'm not saying anything, but yeah.
that's great.
So, which I took as
Take a
consent.
picture.
B, did you have a question?
Well, I was just, one of, if I'm not mistaken, one of the exemption categories is if you're asking people to respond to a questionnaire or survey in their professional role, right? So you could go to a senior administrator and say, how many programs do you have that treat children and how long have they been in existence and where does the funding come from? You can't say, how do you feel about it?
So,
Right. But I seem to remember that, you know, if you wanted to go to, you know, the heads of every council on aging and say, in your council on aging, do you have any exercise programs?
right.
For, you know, for the elderly, that's, you could ask, I think you have to ask. You can't just make a judgment yourself, but you could ask for exemption on the basis that you're not asking for anything for.
So that's a great question, and in my office, what we would do is actually ask to look at the questions that you're planning on asking them, because we might not even call that human subjects research, because you're asking an individual something about a program or something about, well, I'll just leave it at program, and essentially they're providing information not about themselves. So you're interacting with a human, but you're not seeking information about that human. Instead, you're getting information about a policy or a program. It's almost like if you could read it in a book, like you could go, or you could read it online, right? This program offers this many services, but instead that person is a conduit to that information. We might not consider that human subjects research at all. If you were to ask, so there is an exemption category specific for, well, there is an exemption category specific to people that are elected or appointed individuals. So if they are in their position because they were elected or appointed to be so, then that is an exemption category in and of itself, which, as a caveat, all these regulations that we follow currently they're being rewritten, or they were rewritten and they were approved on January 19th of 2017 with a compliance date on January 19th of 2018. So we're going to have new regulations if the current administration decides that they want to uphold this regulation that was put out January 19th, 2017. So that's a long story to say we don't actually know whether or not we're going to have to comply to these new regulations in January. And in that new regulation, that exemption category specific to people that were elected or appointed individuals is no longer. It's been erased. And part of the reason why is it's just sort of combined. I don't think it really offers anything.
Have you ever invoked?
Yes, we have actually, because we do urban and environmental policy does a lot of stuff with like town officials, and so the only time I think we've ever done it is if we've done category 2 and category 3. Sorry, we're now talking regulations. Those two categories are the same, except that one is for like people and one is for everybody else that's unelected or unappointed officials, right? So we've got the sort of two categories and they're being combined into one. So I just got way into the weeds on that answer, but certainly we do look at even if somebody is giving sort of their recommendations or their personal beliefs, we do look at like whether or not that speaking on the record is going to have any risk in their employability. Might they not want to speak on the record because of their position, or might they be speaking on the record all the time because of their position? So we do take that into account when assessing risk, and then looking about whether or not it can be exempt research or it has to go to expedited or full. Yeah. We do look at anonymity as well, yes. So if we... Exactly, yep. Exactly. So we allow a little bit more risk, if you will. Wait, you've heard me say this before. I call them ho-hum questions versus uh-oh questions. We allow a little bit more when it is going to be spoken sort of more off the record than on.
Let me actually close with a more somber note by asking, what can happen if we, meaning members of the IRB, investigators, fail to protect research subjects?
I love this question.
What is the scope of the things that can happen?
You can lose all federal funding to the entire university, meaning the hospital, all 7 schools, etc. And you don't want to be that person. That's the highest.
The best part will be having your picture displayed prominently.
So individuals can lose funding or be required to repay funding to agencies and can be barred from obtaining further funding. The university can bar investigators from conducting human research, and some very prominent universities have been essentially, research at some very prominent universities has been shut down for very meaningful periods of time when they failed to protect research subjects. So very serious consequences. So before we wrap up, any questions?
That's a really tough question, and one that we do struggle with, particularly with payment. Right? So when you offer something, either a gift or something monetary, it becomes more complicated when the research subject is a child. But they still need their parent to bring them to the research visit, and it depends on the number of visits. And there are different ways that there's very little guidance available, and just there is something that is cited frequently through the literature, which relates, I think, to an Arthritis Foundation position paper from like 1995, and this is the extent of what sort of people have published on this, suggesting you pay people on a per hour basis of something that's reasonable, like $25 an hour, and but $25 an hour is a lot for somebody who works at McDonald's. It's not a lot for a professional. So how do you weigh that? And I think it's one of those things that you sort of know it when you see it, but it's hard to describe. And some of that, I think, is oftentimes in the IRB we'll have a conversation around this and say, well, is that amount too much? Sometimes people say that amount isn't worth, that's not even enough, that they should be paying twice that. And we certainly would not consider that the IRB's decision in that point in time is not final, so that if you initiate your research and nobody shows up because you're not the inducement isn't enough, then we're open to that and to say, let's renegotiate that. Let's think about how you might expand that. But I think it's very difficult to say at what point the person's ability to make an informed decision is biased or becomes, they can't really freely make that decision because, that's $500. I'd be willing to have Ed do 2 biopsies for $500. It's really hard to make that distinction.
Yeah. Was there one more question in the back? Yeah. Very quickly, yes.
I had a question about exemptions, and so if you have an exemption because at the time that you're supposed to study
Exemption is actually a really bad word, I think, because an exemption is still considered human subjects research. It's still research that we considered to be generalizable. It just means that it's exempt from more of the oversight of the committee and kind of that continual oversight that's required of other research studies. So when something qualifies as exempt, we're still saying it's human subjects research. You can conduct the research, you go out and do the research, you use the research for generalizable purposes. So when you, for example, to go to sort of the quality assessment question, if you were to be doing a project that the IRB considers to not be human subjects research, so it's something that's not generalizable, sort of on the offset, your original intent was that it was not for generalizable purposes, we would call that, and at least in my office, we call that excluded or not human subjects research. But let's say, let's say you're doing something for quality assessment and you realize, wow, there really is a good generalizable picture here, and your original intent was not to have it generalizable. I would say call the office, whoever your office, whichever your office is, call one of us. You can never give retroactive approval for a research study. However, when your intent maybe has changed, and I say this with a grain of salt, don't go out doing research studies and say, Laura, I did a research study, I want approval now. When your intent has changed and now all of a sudden there is this generalizable picture or something you want to do with it, give us a call and we can kind of work with you on how best to figure out how to do maybe a secondary analysis approval for that type of research. Does that help answer?
Absolutely. So, right. So these are, particularly comes for these quality assurance kind of projects. You do it and you realize, wow, this is actually some information that would be valuable to everybody to know. Hand washing works, or we can get people to wash their hands doing this. But at some point you transition from something that's just quality assurance to something that really is human subjects research. And there absolutely are ways to transition from one to another. It's just important to do that, to make that distinction and to communicate with the IRB. And the reasons for that are relate in part to our obligation through HHS and for funding, and but the other is that now most journals will require that you provide them with approval for, a documentation of IRB approval. And I'm sure you've gotten the requests that say, I have to submit my article, can you give me my letter of approval? And that's kind of the wrong approach to this, but by all means, was that?
Yeah.
It was.
You used to make those noises at the IRB meetings too, didn't you? When I would pontificate.
Well, I want to thank all our panelists. If you have more questions, come on up front.
That was fun. Let's do that again. It sounded like a motorcycle.
Was it cattle?
It was a motorcycle for Barbara Rigby.